You were involved in designing an ambitious project to make Mumbai a world-class city. And building a city with unplanned growth and unchecked migrations must be a nightmare for you, and must have seriously eroded the livability of Mumbai. What are your experiences, especially when you developed embarked on this project? What were the main objectives? What were the design strategies that you really had in mind when you embarked on this project?
As far as Mumbai is concerned, as you know, that Mumbai is the financial center, the financial capital of the country. Mumbai has had always the most prominent position amongst the cities in India. But what was happening was that because of the limitations of infrastructure, because of the job creation, the issues in job creation, because slums, so a lot of investment was not coming into Mumbai, one. And also a lot of other cities were competing now with Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Delhi itself, Gurgaon. So a lot of the cities were actually at were competing with Mumbai. So that was domestically, but externally also, there were a lot of other city-states were very heavily competing with So Mumbai's position as one of the premier financial center was getting compromised. And so we had to prepare a plan to see how does that get revived back. So our entire strategy was so it was clearly one pivotal area was the infrastructure part. And when we made the total addition of all the infrastructure, this was in 2003, we found that the total investment that will be required is of the order of about $60 billion. It's a massive in one city. And when I'm talking about one city, I'm talking about the surrounding, the metropolitan region as well. So, and that consisted of developing the metro rail, developing a trans-harbour link, which will connect the island city with the mainland, developing a new airport. So there are several initiatives were a part of it. And invisible infrastructure also, like the extension of the water supply systems, the sewage system, the drainage system. So all of that was a part of this. So one was to create a financial, all the financial resources that you need for developing this. But that was just one part of it. And that, I think, is important learning from our perspective, is that if you just talk about projects, if you talk about mega projects, then people don't see what does it do for them, So people tend to believe that it's going to benefit a handful, or probably sometimes some people might feel that's a sweet deal given to somebody. Sometimes people might feel that, the private sector might feel that, look, all the risk is on us, and there's nothing to be done. So it gets into a logjam. So we felt that, apart from, of course, addressing these issues, we felt that we need to create a larger vision. And the larger vision infrastructure, of course, will become part of it. But how does overall the city actually move up the value chain? How does it become a city which now doesn't necessarily have to compete with the other cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad, but actually can take on cities like Dubai or Shanghai or Singapore, and actually attract global capital into the city? Now, for that, infrastructure, transformation of infrastructure is important. But not only that, how do you create jobs? What kind of jobs you create in the city of Mumbai? How do you address the issue of slum rehabilitation? How do you see that the governance mechanism change so that everybody is aligned in terms of their incentives, political, economic, social? All the incentives are aligned for people to move together in unison to make it happen. How do you see that even the judiciary, the activists, everybody feels that, that this is not a sellout. It's not just, it's something that the city is actually going to expand, which is going to grow into a better city. And it's going to, otherwise the default future would be that it might actually not be able to even compete with cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad. So that was the overarching vision. And I think that vision became very important for us, because when people saw infrastructure only as a part of that overall vision. It was not infrastructure for the sake of doing infrastructure. So that's one part. The second is even getting the private sector to participate. How do you get the private sector to participate? How do they feel confident that when they invest, that they will actually not lose out? How do foreign investors feel about it? What is it that we need to do to attract them? So there are several things that were done to make that into a vision. And I'm happy to say that, successfully all the governments have actually held it together. And I think one of the key things out there was getting the citizens involved. So we had something like a citizens action group, a lot of prominent citizens from Mumbai. They're from the business community, some of the retired judges of the high courts or supreme courts, activists, educationists. So they all lawyers. So there was a group that was formed, and it was also told to them this is what you plan to do. So there was an alignment that was created of some of the respected people in the city. That gave a certain amount of credibility to this plan, and it became that much easier to implement it. If you do it in the absence of that, you might be lucky to make those things happen, but you'll still, at some point in time, you'll face some difficulties, which you might not be able to move forward because of those difficulties.
Yeah, apart from the social challenges that you spoke about, any other challenges that you can elaborate on in setting up this mega city?
So one, of course, was how do you fund this very large investment? One part is that there are several projects where the private sector is not interested in participating. These projects could be, say, sewage projects or drainage projects or water supply projects. At this point of time, at least the tariff systems are not such that the private sector would be really very keen on participating in those projects. So how do you get funding for that? So the two elements that were incorporated. One, of course, is that the government resources should be channelized only to those areas where the private sector does not really want to come in. So there was a framework that was available where first you test out whether the private sector is going to be willing to participate or not. And if at all the private sector is not willing to participate, only reserve those areas for the government funding. So that's one part. The second part is also get some of the bilateral and multilateral agencies on board, like the World Bank and that time the DFIDs and the KFWs, and get them to be involved in these projects, which are where you require capital. And this capital is available at a fairly concessional rate and over a very long period. So that framework was created because that was a challenge in terms of it looks very nice to build something, but this is an infrastructure which is fundamental to the movement to the city, but it's not visible. So nobody is going to get brownie points for that. But at the same time, you've got to make that investment. So that's one part. The second part is boosting the confidence of the private sector itself to put in money. Because by nature, these are large infrastructure projects. They'll have to be executed over 4 or 5, terms of the political offices. So how do you ensure that they feel confident about the framework that they're getting into? And that, I think, was done by creating a robust framework. Actually, even the government of India created a very robust framework, in which the state government and the cities either added to it or at least strengthened it, and got the private sector to believe that, and they was absolutely satisfied that the framework that you have will actually sustain the test of time. So even if somebody calls in question, either the courts or the subsequent political establishments call into question, you can defend it, saying that this was done on a transparent basis. I'm happy to say that a lot of the infrastructure projects were subsequently, almost all of them, were never questioned subsequently because of the robust framework that was followed. I think therein lies a very important lesson. I think that you have to believe that by virtue of doing projects of this kind, these are going to be questioned by people, by the political class. These are going to be questioned, and I think perhaps that's the right way also in a democracy to go about. If they're going to be questioned, you need to have a framework which should be able to say as to why this is justified and why that is the best way to go forward. That will be the insulation for you against anything that could subsequently go wrong. So that was the other thing. Third one, of course, was communication, because government typically is not very good at communicating things. That what is it doing? It doesn't like to. By and large, the governments would like to do things, but government does not necessarily have to take the opinions of the people, get that on board. And so by creating the citizens group, we actually created a framework where there was a lot of discussion that was happening. So everybody felt involved in the entire process. So I think that was the third challenge, the challenge of communication. That the challenge of communication was then not only taken up by the government, but by these individuals who were involved in this process. They used to then communicate about what the intention of these projects is. So I think that became an important aspect, which is a very, very important learning, is to regularly communicate with the people about what you plan to do. And the fourth, which is my last thing, is to let the people sometimes believe that, okay, this is all big talk, okay, and there's nothing going to happen. So it's important for us to identify, the low-hanging fruits and make them happen. So once you show that, you're serious about it, and these are the things that you've already done, then the confidence gets built. Quite often people tend to believe that, look, you're just going to build infrastructure, going to make our life more miserable than what they are today, right? So they don't. And that's the apprehension that people have. And if at all you can communicate that well with them, saying that what you're going to do about it, then people are willing to bear and they feel confident that you mean what you say, they're willing to bear a little bit of inconvenience. I can tell you that people have tremendous amount of patience to meet their future, a brighter future. But I think you need to give them confidence that's going to happen. And for that, I think it's important to start off with these low-hanging fruits, which you should be in a position to demonstrate and show that you can actually make. You're serious in what you're saying.
Yeah, I think transparency and communication is key in anything that we do. But what is your experience and what advice can you give to Sri Lanka on public-private partnership? Because we seem to be in Sri Lanka, government is involved in most of the infrastructure project development, and we haven't really, our country have not really evolved to that level. So what advice can you give to Sri Lanka on making this happen?
Actually, I can just talk about what India did and what I was a part of. So I don't think I'm in a position to advise because I think every country works in its own works in its own system. But I think there are certain basic principles. I think if at all you are able to keep that in mind, then I think it should be fairly simple. One is that I would suggest that if you have a framework of concessions, saying that a model framework in India, there are ports or airports, there are model concession agreements which have been and everybody has to follow that model concession agreement. There is no change depending on the project or the party. There is no change. That's a model concession agreement that is followed. So you have a framework within which, regardless of the project, that framework gets to rule. So that's important. And that framework essentially is a list of rules that will be followed, regardless of which company is trying to invest. So that was done very well by creating these model concession agreements. So that's one part I would strongly suggest. The second thing is that invariably the tendency on the part of the governments is to transfer all the risk to the private sector. So it could be issues of, say, rehabilitation or resettlement. Now I can tell you that the eminent domain as the government domain cannot be used by the private companies, and it should not even be used by the private companies. So there should be a realization that there are certain things only government can do and government should do. To expect, say for example, we talked about, say, slum rehabilitation. To expect private company to, in the absence of a framework, to get is catastrophic. It should not be done. So you need to have that framework also in place to ensure that the eminent domain of the government is used by the government, and the private sector only essentially gets into areas which are essentially akin to getting better technology, speed of execution, efficiency. So these are the expertise of the private sector. But the eminent domain is something that the private sector really cannot do much, and the government should not expect the private sector to do. So that risk should not be transferred to the private sector. That's the other thing. The other element which has been a big learning for us is that sometimes in the face of more competition is good, but sometimes the competition becomes so intense that it starts cannibalizing each other. So all the developers. So this has happened in India also, that fewer number of projects being chased by large number of developers. Then people build outrageously, and then the PPPs get a bad name. So it's important to create a set of people who can be pre-qualified, and then only they are subject to competition, rather than getting a project to be competed by 60 or 70 parties that could destroy a project. Lastly, I feel that even after all of this, there could be something unforeseen that could happen, okay? And there could be some event that can suddenly create some issues. So there should be a certain amount of flexibility available to negotiate, which again can be a transparent system of negotiation, so that if that risk actually occurs, then you could renegotiate those contracts. So, but those could be absolutely the last resort and absolutely the exceptional circumstances. But there has to be a framework, because 10, 15 years down the line, what is going to happen, nobody can predict today. And if that happens, then we need to give some leeway to the private companies also, to say that, look, there will be somebody behind me if something unforeseen happens. So these are a few of my suggestions, not necessarily, and I don't know how relevant they would be in this context.
Thank you, Sanjay.